Welcome to another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. You're listening to a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State, featuring writer, poet, and musician Rick Pidcock. Now here's Rick.
On Tuesday, April 22nd, Attorney General Pam Bondi met with the task force against anti-Christian bias in order to identify the persecution they believe Christians are facing at the hand of the government. It's ironic because 87% of Congress identify as Christians. Former President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris identify as Christians. 98% of Republicans identify as Christians, and conservative Christians in particular control all branches of the federal government. When President Obama was elected in 2009, 42% of white evangelicals believed they were being persecuted. But today, 60% believe so. In an almost directly mirrored contrast, in 2009, 59% of white evangelicals believed LGBTQ people were facing a lot of discrimination, whereas today, just 39% do. The idea that Christians are being persecuted and discriminated against has been baked into Trump's courting of evangelicals since the very beginning. When Trump first started reaching out to religious leaders in 2015, he invited a group to his boardroom on the 26th floor of the Trump Tower in New York City. One of the people there was Lance Wallnau, who wrote about his experience on Facebook, and he talked about how the conversation in that meeting focused on the media persecuting Trump and Christians. He remembers Trump saying, "I never punch indiscriminately. I'm a counterpuncher. If you get hit and do nothing, it sends the wrong message." There's that retribution we've been talking about recently. And then one of the leaders said, "It's open season on Christians in particular." And then Trump played into that, into these fears of persecution, and went on a rant about how New Yorkers can't say Merry Christmas anymore. Then Wallnau wrote that Trump told them, "Every other ideological group in the country has a voice. If you don't mind me saying so, you guys have gotten soft." And Wallnau said that was the line he won't forget. But Trump wasn't finished sharing his thoughts about what ails conservative Christianity. He said, "People who identify themselves as Christian make up probably the single largest constituency in the country, but there's absolutely no unity, no punch in exercising that power, not in political consensus or any other area that I can see." So notice the motivation here. Trump is talking about persecution against Christians to a group of Christians. He's getting them riled up about the media. And then he's telling them that they've gotten soft and that they're the largest constituency in the United States. This is about getting votes. He said, "You have no punch in your power." This is about using evangelicals in order for Trump to get elected by appealing to their persecution complex and their desire for power. So, as the meeting came to a close, Wallnau says that he took Trump aside and told him privately, he said, "The thing we need to do more than anything is to find a way of taking these 10,000 spokes and connect them into a hub of some sort so that there is a unified voice. Our people here need to work together." And he said that Trump looked him directly in the eye and agreed and said, "You're absolutely right. That's what needs to be done." And then Trump looked to the group and said, "I will tell you this. Christians will have a friend in the Trump presidency." So Trump and the religious leaders agreed. They're all being persecuted by media elites, that Christians were being too soft, and that the solution was to come together in a unified voice to punch back in an exercise of power by voting for Donald Trump. Now fast forward to Trump's second term. After promising white evangelicals they'd have more power than they'd ever had before if they voted for him, this is what Trump said at the National Prayer Breakfast on February 6th, 2025.
To confront such weaponization and religious persecution, today I'm signing an executive order to make our Attorney General, who's a great person, she's going to be a great Attorney General, Pam Bondi, the head of a task force, brand new, to eradicate anti-Christian bias. About time, right? Anti-Christian bias. Yeah, you never heard of that one before, right? But it's about time, isn't it, though, really? So many times you hear, but you don't hear the anti-Christian bias. The mission of this task force will be to immediately halt all forms of anti-Christian targeting and discrimination within the federal government, including at the DOJ, which was absolutely terrible, the IRS, the FBI, terrible, and other agencies.
As you might expect, the Freedom from Religion Foundation opposes the task force. They said in a statement, "The Constitution demands neutrality, not special treatment for one religion." It's notable that there isn't any task force against anti-Muslim bias, or anti-LGBTQ bias, or anti-immigrant bias, or anti-women bias. There are all kinds of biases out there that we could have task forces for, but they're not there. Christianity gets a task force. So is Christianity receiving special treatment? Or is Christianity, despite the overwhelming percentages of Christians in power, actually somehow facing persecution at the hands of those in power? And what evidence is the Trump administration putting out there to support their claims? Here's Attorney General Pam Bondi at the task force's first meeting on Tuesday, and I'm going to play her comments in full.
Thank you all for joining us today. We're excited to be here for the launch of the Task Force to Eradicate Anti-Christian Bias as outlined in the President's Executive Order. Joining me today are members of the task force and individuals who have been impacted by the anti-Christian bias. Together, this task force will identify any unlawful anti-Christian policies, practices, or conduct across the government, seek input from the faith-based organizations and state governments to end anti-Christian bias, find and fix deficiencies in existing and regulatory practices that might contribute to the anti-Christian bias. As President Trump has stated, the Biden administration engaged in an egregious pattern of targeting peaceful Christians while ignoring violent anti-Christian offenses. The president is right. Biden's Department of Justice abused and targeted Christians. Pro-life Christians were arrested and imprisoned for peacefully praying outside abortion clinics. The FBI spied on traditional Catholics in their parishes. President Biden declared Easter Sunday to be Transgender Day of Visibility. No longer. Vandalism against churches was 8 times higher in 2023 than it was in 2018. And it's at President Trump's directive, we ended those abuses at the Department of Justice on day one. We dropped 3 ongoing cases against pro-lifers and redefined the FACE Act to ensure that abuse would not continue and that American tax dollars were not used to support the weaponization of our legal system to target Christians. Just a few weeks ago, we convicted a man in Arizona for a plot to bomb Christian churches. The Department of Justice will protect religious liberty for Christians and for all Americans. We'll work closely with everyone around this table and take a whole of government approach to solving this problem and ultimately protect Americans' First Amendment rights. The First Amendment isn't just a line in the Constitution, it's the cornerstone of our American liberty. It guarantees every citizen the right to speak freely, worship freely, and live according to their conscience without government interference. Protecting Christians from bias is not favoritism. It's upholding the rule of law and fulfilling the constitutional promise. Thank you to President Trump. We have an incredible opportunity, all of us around this table, to protect the rights of all citizens from discrimination based on their religious beliefs. And thank you all for being here based on this executive order, and I look forward to doing great work together.
So I'd like to spend the rest of the episode looking into the 4 examples that Bondi gives of anti-Christian bias and see if any or all of them hold up. The first thing she said was that pro-life Christians were arrested and imprisoned for peacefully praying outside abortion clinics. Now, if that's actually what happened, then what they did was likely obnoxious, but I don't know that it would be illegal, depending on how and where they were doing it. But as you would expect, a closer look at the facts shows that that's not exactly what happened. According to NBC News, quote, the 9 people forcefully entered the clinic and set about blocking 2 doors to the medical facility using their bodies, furniture, chains, and ropes, the Justice Department said in a statement. The indictment also alleges that the defendants violated the FACE Act by using a physical obstruction to injure, intimidate, and interfere with the clinic's employees and a patient. So, a nurse ended up with a sprained ankle after getting pushed, and a woman who was having labor pains was being aggressively approached by another one of them. And then when the police went to Lauren Handy's home, who was one of the peaceful prayers, supposedly, they discovered 5 dead fetuses. So Pam Bondi is simply lying. They weren't peacefully praying outside an abortion clinic. They were forcing their way in. They were injuring workers and patients, and they were storing dead fetuses in their home. But after being sentenced to just under 5 years in prison, Handy was pardoned just a few days into the Trump presidency. The second thing Pam Bondi brought up, she said the FBI spied on traditional Catholics in their parishes. That sounds horrible. Who would want that? But they were actually investigating a group of militiamen who were promoting a civil war and the assassinations of politicians. These men were recruiting soldiers and were offering weapons training inside of seminaries and churches that were part of the Rad Trad movement that had been cut off from the Catholic Church, and who thought Pope Francis was part of a big Masonic conspiracy theory. So this isn't about traditional Catholics. This is these just innocent conservative Christians. These were militia groups that even had ties to Timothy McVeigh, who met with one of the priests of this religious movement one day before renting the truck for the Oklahoma City bombing. If you're interested in hearing more about this Rad Trad movement, I may do a whole episode on it at some point soon. But in the meantime, you can check out 2 articles that I wrote about the movement last year. One was titled, What J.D. Vance and Harrison Butker Have in Common. That was on July 22nd, 2024 at Baptist News Global. And then also, the second one was, The Harrison Butker Story is So Much Weirder Than You Know. And that was on May 24th, 2024. Unfortunately, though, the government had to stop their investigation into these militia groups due to it supposedly being anti-Christian bias and religious persecution. Or as Pam Bondi puts it, the FBI spied on traditional Catholics in their parishes. The next thing Pam Bondi brought up was she said President Biden declared Easter Sunday to be Transgender Day of Visibility. So, Trans Visibility Day has been happening on March 31st every year for 15 years at that point. It happened again this year on March 31st for the 16th year. March 31st is the date. And as you know, Easter Sunday is always changing. The date changes for Easter because it's based on a formula that takes into account the lunar calendar and the spring equinox. Last year, Easter Sunday just happened to fall on March 31st. In other words, President Biden didn't declare anything. He certainly didn't declare Easter Sunday to be the Transgender Day of Visibility. That was literally just a coincidence that Easter Sunday just happened to fall on March 31st last year. All this is doing is playing into the white conservative fear of transgender people and the demonization of transgender people that Trump basically won the presidency on with his final ad campaigns leading up to the day of the election. So once again, Bondi and the Trump administration are simply lying here. There's no way around that. There is no conservative defense of saying Biden made that day on Easter. The next thing she said was that vandalism against churches was 8 times higher in 2023 than it was in 2018. Of course, any crimes against church property need to be investigated, but most of these crimes are relatively small offenses like broken windows or graffiti. And according to the USA, the number of vandalism incidences against churches remains small compared with incidents targeting abortion clinics documented annually by the National Abortion Federation, an abortion rights group. So, yes, if there are hate crimes going on against churches, especially like black churches that are being set on fire and things like that, we need to look into those. If there are, some broken glass here and there, that doesn't necessarily rise to the level of a federal investigation. All 4 of these examples cited by the Trump administration are simply complete nonsense. There's literally nothing to any of these stories they chose to highlight as the basis for their task force. So is there an example out there somewhere of anti-Christian bias? I'd imagine probably, but it's apparently not serious enough of an issue to create a government task force and a national narrative out of. Someone who has been on top of the story since the beginning has been Hemant Mehta, who is also known as the Friendly Atheist, and I'd highly recommend checking out his Substack article titled Trump's Task Force to Eradicate Anti-Christian Bias is a Complete Waste of Time. He wrote it back on February 7th, 2025. I'd imagine he may be updating the story again soon, given the meeting the other day, and he's posted some comments on social media, so maybe he might bring it up again here soon. But I completely agree with what he wrote in February. He said, "This isn't ultimately about eradicating anti-Christian bias. It's a symbolic move to reinforce Christian supremacy." And then he quoted Americans United for Separation of Church and State, who said, quote, "If Trump really cared about religious freedom and ending religious persecution, he'd be addressing anti-Semitism in his inner circle, anti-Muslim bigotry, hate crimes against people of color and other religious minorities. But instead, he's abolishing federal programs and protections that address those wrongs. This task force is not a response to Christian persecution. It's an attempt to make America into an ultra-conservative Christian nationalist nation." And that's a claim that actually has evidence for it, like this entire story. If anything, we should have a task force on Christian nationalism. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Please like, subscribe, and rate us on your favorite podcast platform, and we'll be back with another episode on Monday.
This has been another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. The episode you've just heard is part of a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State. Be sure to follow BNG daily at baptistnews.com and subscribe to get notifications about future episodes. Baptist News Global is a national nonprofit news service that is independent, free, and faithful. BNG is supported by readers and listeners like you. Learn more at baptistnews.com.